So I'd firstly like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet today. It's going to be different for all of us, but for me, it is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. By way of introduction, my name is Daniel Stone. I'm the Executive Director of a company called Principleco that works with a lot of advocacy organisations and campaigns to try and make social change work a bit more effective and impactful. And when COVID first started, we, along with a number of other organisations, including The Guardian, Essential Media, the Centre for Australian Progress, the Community Council of Australia, and the Australian Climate Foundation, all came together to create Australia at Home, which is the program this conversation is a part of. It's designed to be a meeting place for civil society to kind of bring us together when we're all trapped in our homes, and especially at the start when a lot of us were feeling a bit anxious, a bit nervous, and weren't really sure about what the future looked like. So our goal here is to think a bit more about the future and think a bit more about the past and step back from some of the worries that face us. If you haven't been before, go to australiahome.com.au. You can see some of our previous conversations and some of the ones we've got coming up over the next few weeks. Some general ground rules before I start. You can see in the chat there, we have Hannah, who is our technical support helper today. If you have any challenges with audio or video, just let her know and she can help you while the conversation's going. We're also going to be recording this session and are recording this session to share later with people who couldn't make it. So if that's an issue with you, please just let Hannah know and we can work with you to address that. We'll also be keeping everybody on mute just so that we don't have a huge cacophony of background sounds. But that being said, we do really, really want to bring as many questions to the forefront as we can. So jump in the chat, put your questions and thoughts in there. I'm sure you'll have lots of them, and we'll be trying to pull people forward throughout the conversation to pose their questions to Malcolm. And we'll unmute you when the time is right to do that. One thing I will just say about the chat is, obviously when we've had conversations about kind of contested political matters, people have strong opinions and strong views. I just remind everybody to be respectful about that and to remember that the spirit of Australia at Home is to kind of connect and feel close to each other, not to create more stress in everyone's lives. So please just consider that when you're putting your questions there. And my last point is I really encourage you to put your video on if you haven't already, and to flick it to the grid mode if you haven't. I see so many of you already have, which is wonderful because we can see each other's faces and feel like we are all here with each other, which is really lovely. So now just to get underway. So I feel like Malcolm Turnbull needs no introduction. If you've been living on the moon though, here's a quick recap. He was Australia's 29th Prime Minister and has a long history of extremely notable work, with colourful hijinks playing out with Kerry Packer, the UK government, Donald Trump, and one of my personal favourites from the book with Vladimir Zhurovsky, who is a very interesting Russian politician. But it is both his achievements in the past as well as some of the perceived failures through that period that I think we really wanted to explore today, and many of you have written to us saying that we'd like to discuss, as well as, importantly, what we can take from those experiences to build a stronger and more prosperous future. I'd also like to introduce Christine Jackman, who's going to be kind of coordinating this session with me today. She's a former foreign correspondent and a member of the Canberra Press Gallery, author of Inside Kevin 07, so lots of experience seeing how the sausage is made, so to speak, and now works as a communications consultant. Before we get into the heart of the meaty conversation though, I wanted to ask a broader question that we've asked of every single guest we've had on Australia at Home. And I'll start with you, Malcolm, which is, how are you going at the moment? How have you been feeling in your home over the last couple of weeks? Has it been a challenging time? Has it been an exciting time? How has it been going?
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be with you. And can I echo your acknowledgement of country too? Yeah, look, it's been different. I mean, Luce and I are much better situated than many people, than most people, I imagine. We have a house. It's a comfortable house in a nice part of Sydney, and we're financially secure. This is a very rough ride for many people, not just during the the quarantine, but with the economic disruption that is going to follow. But no doubt we can talk about all of that. No, but we're doing well. I been assembling my home television studio, which I've never really done much before, and I'm glad to say I've got a bit of innovative Australian technology in front of me. I managed to get a Rode microphone. They're a great Australian advanced manufacturing business in Silverwater and Sydney. So they're good. Now, you mentioned Zhirinovsky, by the way, who is completely, is it like literally out of a caricature of himself. Here is the bottle of Zhirinovsky vodka he gave me.
Oh, wow.
And I literally found it a couple of weekends ago in the back of a cupboard, never been opened. And he gave that to me, would have been in 1994.
Wow.
And yes, he was quite a character in that bizarre Russian political environment.
Yes, good thing is I know that vodka doesn't go off, so you got to enjoy that for years.
Yeah. Well, I honestly, I remember him giving it to me, but I thought I'd lost it.
Yeah.
But, anyway.
Right now, through to you, Christine. How have you been finding the last couple of weeks?
Thanks, Daniel. Actually, it turns out it's a really pertinent question because I've been concerned about this very staid and fluorescent lit back environment that I'm in. And by way of explanation, I have very recently joined the world's largest intensive care study focused on COVID-19 treatment. I am coming to you from one of Brisbane's largest hospitals, Prince Charles, where we are coordinating, I think it's now over 300 hospitals in 47 countries around the world, where they are attempting to share in real time the treatment, various treatments and other information about what works in treating the sickest COVID-19 patients. So firstly, apologise for the background, but that's given me both the privilege but also the challenge of really, I guess, experiencing or witnessing this pandemic at a very close quarters, I suppose. There are a couple of patients in ICU here with it. And I have to say I am sleep deprived. I am feeling, I guess, a lot like Malcolm. I feel very lucky that we have a large house and those sorts of facilities. But I have children who are struggling with, trying to keep up to date with schooling from home, which I think any family is now realising is a very difficult thing. And thank you to all teachers who do this day in and day out, because it's a very special skill that most of us don't have. So thank you for asking, Daniel. How are you?
I'm okay. I went and stayed with my family for the last couple of weeks up on the wonderful Central Coast. So I feel very refreshed and recharged after getting out of the city, because that was all a bit mad when I first left when things were starting to build. So feeling a lot better than I was a few weeks ago. Which I think brings us to like the first thing that we were thinking about exploring, which is of all of the different places around New South Wales. Christine, I know you were thinking about...
Malcolm, I just have to ask very directly, let's skip to the chase. Have you been tapped for Eden Monero yet? When's that coming?
No, I have. If nominated, I will not stand. If elected, I would not serve. Was that Adelaide Stevenson that said that?
Yeah,
but the I think no. Gosh, it's watching those events with Barilaro and Andrew Constance over the last few days. I'm reminded, as I used to often be in politics, of what Mark Twain said, that only fiction has to be credible.
I think there is a more serious question to this, though, which is that, we'd like to believe that politics, party politics is a team sport, but never have we seen sort of a greater and more, well, I won't say never, but this has been a great demonstration of politics as an ego-driven individual sport. Are we naive to think that political parties can be anything more than just a group of power-driven individuals?
Well, they're all power-driven, but political parties are power-driven. The object of a political party is to win government and hold government, right? The premise of a political party is that you get a big tent political party. I don't mean, a narrow, sectional party, but a broad tent, big tent political party is that you get a bunch of people in the room, they debate issues, they come to a conclusion, a consensus, majority, if you like, and then they all get back in behind it, right? Now, that's the whole point of having a party. What has happened in the Liberal Party in particular, and in the Nationals to an extent as well, is that the populist right, and these people are not conservatives, by the way. You know, as I often say, they don't know the difference between Edmund Burke and Tony Burke for the most part. So they're generally populist, right-wing, reactionary characters with a jumble of views, you know, anti-science, you know, that kind of, all that stuff. And they, as I found on several occasions, do not accept the premise. So their proposition is, if you do not do what we want, we will blow the joint up, to the point of actually wanting the government to lose. So at the end of 18, and I mean, for you know, a good 12 months before my government came to an end, you know, people like Abbott and Alan Jones and, you know, Bolt and all of these characters in this sort of right-wing populist ecosystem were trying to bring down the government in the expectation that Labor would win. But as Murdoch said to Kerry Stokes, 3 years of Labor wouldn't be so bad, because they would rather have Labor in than have a leader of the Liberal Party who they did not control. So it's really wild, loopy stuff. But this is a major problem for the coalition parties, because you do have an element that literally does not accept the premise, the team sport premise that you laid out earlier.
Why do you think it's emerged in the coalition parties specifically?
Well, I think there is an alliance, and it actually is often quite explicit. I mean, you look at the conspiracy, there's only way you can describe it, you know, that was going on at the end of 2017 involving George Christensen, Bolt and Credlin, and they all owned up to this, by the way, subsequently, to bring down the government. You know, there is a sort of essentially this toxic alliance between the political right, the populist right inside the political parties, their amplifiers and collaborators in the right-wing media, almost entirely Murdoch's media. And then on particular issues, you've got vested interests. So on climate policy, obviously the fossil fuel sector oppose reducing emissions, you know, I mean, generally. And that's the bit I can understand. You know, I can understand someone who owns a coal mine saying, gosh, I want to keep selling coal. But the sort of science denialism is, the denialism of climate change and global warming is as loopy as the anti-vaxxers. I hope I'm not offending anyone. And as loopy as, you know, as I said in a speech, you know, years ago, it's as loopy as ignoring the advice of your doctor on the basis that someone you met down the pub told you that their Uncle Ernie had smoked a carton of cigarettes a day and lived to 100, right? So, you know, but, you know, how much loopiness were we seeing in the early stages of this pandemic?
Mm.
You know, I mean, you've still got Bolsonaro there in Brazil saying it's no big deal. So where does this anti-science thing come from, and how? This is a real good question to talk about, I think, because I can't pinpoint an answer. Why has an issue, say in climate being the best example, why has an issue which is essentially a question of science and physics become the subject of belief, of values or identity issue? You know, it is, I mean, I can understand gay marriage being in that category. I totally get that. And, you know, that's another hot button issue for that group. But, you know, global warming, I mean, what's next? Are we going to make gravity an issue of belief? That'll be interesting.
Malcolm, on that point, one thing that we're going to jump to a bit later, but I think is really interesting to bring up here. Yeah. And I know that on that point, you've kind of express this theme, and I know one of your little catchphrases that I thought was quite charming was we need to have engineering and economics, not ideology and idiocy, which I think most people here would stand by. But I think I'd be really interested to know, and I know many people who are on this chat are involved in advocacy in some way, whether it's local community organisations or your institutions, is as someone who's arguably lost their job twice trying to push that line, why is that the case, and what needs to change for policy to start being driven a bit more by facts than opinions?
Well, I think there are two things that I would say would change the coalition's position, or at least change the position of the right in the coalition. One would be a massive electoral defeat, which doesn't seem to be likely. And, this is where, as I've said publicly, I think it's pretty hard to argue with, actually. The 2019 election was an election that Labor lost and the coalition didn't deserve to win. But, and it certainly wasn't lost, climate wasn't a determinative issue there. But so electoral defeat would be one thing. The other thing would be if Lachlan Murdoch changed his mind about climate policy. I mean, you cannot underestimate the determination of the Murdoch media to, in effect, dictate coalition policy, and there is a very, I mean, you saw this in the Abbott government massively, where they felt they were part of the government. They felt they were getting access to government decisions before ministers were.
Is it just the Murdoch press, or what role do the Minerals Council and other kind of stakeholders play that are invested in maintaining?
Well, not as influential as you think. I mean, one of the I think mistakes that it is easy for people to make, particularly for people who have got take a sort of a Marxist, or you might even say a sort of a rational approach to economics. I'm not saying Marxism is necessarily always rational. It's not, but if you say, okay, people are acting in order to preserve their economic dominance, and that everything's got an economic rationale, I don't think that works. I don't think that's right. I mean, why has flat incomes for working class people and middle income people? Why has flat incomes and rising inequality benefited not the left, but the populist right? I mean, Peter Lewis would probably have a keen view on that. But, the beneficiaries of unemployment and deindustrialisation in the Midwest has not been the Democrats, the party closely associated with organised labour. It's been the Republican Party led by a populist in the shape of Donald Trump. And so what's happening is that people are being mobilised around values issues. And so instead of identifying themselves politically through their economic interest, they've been mobilised on, identity issues, and or values issues, and that can be gay marriage. In the States, it's abortion. It could be guns. It could be, obviously, immigration is another one. So there's a lot more going on than just economics. And I think an economic analysis, which is very respectable. I mean, it was Keating who always used to say, quoting Jack Lang, in the great race of life, always back self-interest because it's trying. But that was always my approach in politics. I always assumed people would act in their rational self-interest, but believe me, they don't. They do crazy tribal things.
How much, Malcolm, do you think this emergence of this odd sort of populism, which actually does often, if you drill down, go against people's self-interest, people motivated around a value or an idea or an emotion, how much is it also, do you think, of a symptom of a certain type of campaign, what I see as marketing? And what I mean by that is a sort of a poll-driven approach to campaigning, which instead of suggests that we go to a campaign, we argue a certain set of values and principles and positions, rather says, how can we inflame people's fears,
Yeah.
because we know that's effective. These days we have very sophisticated techniques
Sure.
that can tap into those emotions, and they're only going to get more so with social media data sets and so
Well, they are. I mean, there's we've gone from a world in which most people got their information through curated media whose object was to appeal to the broadest possible audience. The Sydney Morning Herald, launched in 1840 or thereabouts, had on its front page, "In moderation placing all my glory, while Tories call me Whig and Whigs are Tories," and were lines of Alexander Pope. Now, the old Fairfaxes were not especially politically broad-minded, but they wanted as many readers as possible so they could sell more ads, get more for their ads. Now, and that was basically the model of mass media until pretty recently. And what's happened is a whole series of changes, cable television, subscription television, the internet, obviously, and of course the dramatic reduction in the cost of producing news. I mean, you could literally you could have a continuous television service with a couple of iPhones. I mean, I'm sure there are people that do that. Like it is nuts when you compare it to how expensive it was to produce, video and news content years ago. So what's happened is that people are now narrowcasting, and you can, in effect, elect to live in a little news bubble. It also means that politicians can unscrupulously, and others can unscrupulously target what they patronisingly call in the United States low information voters, which basically means people who are poor, generally poor, old and sick. And these were the people that were targeted with the Medi-scare in 2016, which, if you think about it, was just this extraordinary lie. I mean, it didn't move a vote in Wentworth or in Sydney, inner city electorates. But man, it was potent in Tasmania. It was potent in outer suburbs because people were frightened into thinking that something was going to happen to prevent them, getting access to Medicare, that Medicare was going to be sold. So, and that ability to digitally target, to the ability to send a text message to targeted people, which purported to come from Medicare, saying that, that was extraordinary. Now, I would have thought, if you'd said to me, a year before that, what would happen if the Labor Party tried that, I would say that would be a train wreck for them. They would blow up. Absolutely not. It worked. It was phenomenally successful. So this is the problem, that all of the self-correcting elements of curated media are no longer relevant. And so people can tell the most extraordinary lies and get away with it and target them to the people that are likely to believe it.
Does that condemn all sides to a race to the bottom? If you are the Liberal campaign, you have to respond in kind?
Well, the answer is probably yes. The first lesson is that you cannot any longer regard a falsehood as something that to ignore, because the conventional advice, and this was certainly what Tex was telling us in the 2016 election, and it was, if you respond to this, you will give it salience. So don't talk about it. Now, I think that advice was still probably correct, by the way. There's been a lot of criticism of how we weren't negative enough in the campaign, and I've explained all that in the book. But I'm not convinced if we'd taken a different approach, we would have done any better. The mistake that was made, and was made by me, was not taking on that lie months before when it first arose. We all rolled around laughing. We thought, this is absurd. What are these guys? They smoking something saying this crazy stuff. And in fact, it was a killer argument, a killer point. So the first lesson is you've got to treat it like whack-a-mole. And we did that in the Bennelong by-election. So every time Labor came up with an outrageous, lie about Medicare or something. We just hit it. You've got to do that. But then, of course, the temptation is to do it yourself. And a lot of people, I haven't ever done that in an election campaign, but in the 2019 campaign, certainly the claim that Labor was about to introduce death duties was.
I was wondering when you were going to bring that up, or whether
I would say that there wasn't a lot of evidence for that, but it had a lot of potency.
On this kind of theme, there's two kind of questions related to tradecraft that I really wanted to expand on before we might go to some questions. And this is looking at things in the past. Obviously, there are some issues that a lot of people in the audience might disagree with you on, some that they agree with you on, some they think you've done fantastic work on, some they think you may not have. But I think, I know that when it comes to the Republic, you've been very adamant that it's unlikely to happen until the Queen passes away. I think most people think that's a very reasonable position. I'm not asking about its likelihood. What I would be interested in knowing is, at 94, Her Majesty is now the oldest reigning monarch in British history. It's reasonable to surmise that maybe at some point, it's very likely in the next decade at the very least. If that does occur reliably within our lifetime, who do you think within the coalition might lead a renewed push towards the Republic? If it's a very similar mix to the folk we've got in the Parliament at the moment.
I don't know. I can't think of anyone that would be. Maurice Payne was very involved in the Republican movement at different times. Most of the moderates would be likely to be Republicans. Morrison is certainly not. It is the Republic monarchy issue is very much a values identity issue. And, but I think I think when the Queen's reign ends, however it ends, will be this enormous watershed. And you're not really going to know what the landscape looks like until you get over it and through it. I think that's our best chance of actually holding and winning a referendum. But what the thing we've got to do is not fall for this sort of outdated idea of just having a plebiscite, should we be a republic or not, which is something that Keating and I were proposing, like 25 years ago. It wasn't a bad idea then, perhaps, but it's certainly not a good idea now. The plebiscite question, the advisory vote question should be about whether you have a parliamentary appointed president or a directly elected one. And you want to have that debate really thrashed out. And then once that's resolved, then you present the Constitution Amendment Bill and go to a referendum. So I think as long as we split it in two, I think we can get there. But you can't fight, as many people have found, you can't fight a war on two fronts.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think another question kind of related to that's still around the process of politics is, so during the Republic campaign of 1999, you obviously worked very closely with a large variety of organisations that perhaps you wouldn't have otherwise, and that many Liberal leaders would not likely have worked with. When you've seen how civil society or union campaigns or any of the other kind of forces within the Australian advocacy landscape work, what were you impressed by, and what do you think what would some of your feedback to them be about improving that work?
Well, I think that I'm not sure that I don't know I've got any particular feedback, only other than that, there's a lot of people who are well-meaning and trying to achieve political change, but go about it in a very sort of ham-fisted way. Again, a good example was Bob Brown's anti-Adani caravan, in Queensland. It was obvious that was going to be counterproductive from his point of view, right? But what was that? Just vanity, ego? I don't know. I think there's a lot of unrealistic, amateurish approaches at politics. Ultimately, if you want to affect political change, you have got people to change the way they vote, right? I mean, that is the one thing that every politician believes in. Many of them don't believe in a lot more than this. The one thing they believe in is that they want to get re-elected.
Who do you think of the people on perhaps the unexpected sides of Australian politics, perhaps on the left or in the centre or on an issue base? Which ones of them do you think are very good at getting people to change their vote?
Well, obviously the people who got behind Zali Steggall in Warringah were very good at it. You know, you just have to, you know, that they've been very good. I mean, Clive Palmer, I think, had a big impact on the election, but hey, with $80 million, that buys you a lot of influence, right?
Yeah.
But I think the getting a cut through influential message requires quite a bit of thought. I mean, it is hard when your opponent. Look, here's the problem with money in elections. Okay, so and you know this is a problem we had in 16, in 19. The coalition had more money available to them. And there's quite a bit about this in the book, and you know, discussions with Tex about. I mean, there's a chapter on the 2016 election that I think is, you know, I encourage you to read. The problem with the free media, by which I mean, you know, the nightly news and, you know, radio and all that stuff, is that it tends to focus on process and gaffes and stunts and trivia all too often. And so it crowds out, so it's very hard to get your message as a politician across through that. So that's why paid advertising is so important, because, you know, if you buy a 30-second ad that says, you know, vote for, you know, Malcolm, and, you know, you get a nice white coffee mug, that's the only thing that'll be said in that 30-second ad. So if you're short of money, it's very hard. And the social media campaigning, digital campaigning, of course, has the advantage of being somewhat cheaper. And while it can certainly motivate strategic groups, it's hard to give you the momentum that I think still television does. I mean, again, this is all changing literally before our eyes. So, you know, this may not be, what I just said to you may no longer be applicable in 2022.
Yeah.
On that note, I was going to ask you, Malcolm, particularly regarding people like Clive Palmer, because I am still gobsmacked at how he managed to spend that much money, and I'm sure a lot of it must have been dumped into the corners of the internet that we still don't know exactly what was being said. Should we have a cap on those sorts of interventions in terms of the amounts of money? And are you particularly concerned with how we are about political advertising on social media?
I think a couple of questions there. Should there be limits on spending? Yes. I have been an advocate for many years, for 20 years, of limiting political donations to Australian citizens or people who are otherwise on the electoral roll. So people on the electoral roll, so no unions, no companies, no, you know, clubs, just people, and with an annual cap. I'm not particularly fussed about what that cap would be. I don't know whether it's, you know, $1,500 or $5,000. It's obviously not $50,000. The problem with that, Barry O'Farrell, and I think partly influenced by, you know, my views, and which I had when I was, you know, the treasurer of the Liberal Party, Barry tried to introduce something along those lines in New South Wales and got, you know, defeated in the High Court. So there's quite a lot of, and the unions obviously opposed that. I think we should have. So there were some constitutional issues there. I think we should have those limits. I think, you know, and maybe you should, well, you know, if you did that, obviously Palmer wouldn't have been able to do what he did, but equally I wouldn't have been able to give $1.75 million to the Liberal Party in 2016, because we would have lost the election, because we were being so outspent.
I'm mindful that so I'm mindful that we're a bit over half time, and I know that both Christine and I have had a chance to pose a number of questions, and there've been a lot of chat coming through in the chat. So firstly, we've got a few people on stack, which we'll start to call now, but if you do have a question, please pop it in the chat and we'll try and get through as many people as we can. And one thing I might also just say is, as we call people forward, if you wouldn't mind keeping your questions to 30 seconds, just so we can try and cover as many as we can. So firstly, I'm going to go to Linda in Melbourne, if you're ready to jump up there.
Hello, yeah, thanks. Thanks for all of this. I'm loving the conversation between everybody. I don't know, it'd be great to just keep on having a great big conversation about all of this stuff. It's so fundamental to the future of our country. And we're watching this right-wing populism tear America apart, bring America down. And I don't want the same thing to happen in Australia. And my question, first of all, was, how can we expose the corruption and the dishonesty of the right-wing lunacy to the sector of the Australian public that might be enticed into voting for them again? And is exposing, like, is using rationality and exposing the corruption and the dishonesty, is that what we need to do, or is it something else that we need to do?
Okay, let me make a couple of points. Thanks, Linda. One of the good things we have in Australia, which the Americans don't, is that we've got compulsory voting. So you don't have to spend a lot of time getting out the vote, getting out your base. So in America, they've got the politicians feel they've got to rev up their rusted on voters, and that tends to lead people to, to extremes in terms of their political advocacy. The second thing we've got is our House of Representatives districts are determined independently by the Electoral Commission. And, there's no gerrymandering at the federal level. And that is obviously these redistributions are contested, and, I've had a few arguments with the AEC over the years about it, but they're not a stitch up as they are in America. What happens in America is the congressional districts are determined by state legislatures, and they're determined in a way to protect generally the incumbents. So what that means is, for most of these districts, the real contest is not the general election, it is the primary. So if you're in a seat that's a rusted on Democrat seat, you've got to run off to the left to get the Democrat registered voters to vote for you in the primary, and ditto with the Republicans. So all of that tends to make us focus more on the centre. But I think it is I think this is the way the right operate within the coalition now is, and getting Christine tagged this right at the outset of the discussion. It is a big change, and it is basically holds the coalition hostage. And the only way to that will change is if they feel that they are being dealt, punished electorally for it. And there are, not every member of the Liberal Party takes this approach self-evidently. It is very much it's very much a sort of factional individual thing, and that's why Abbott getting so roundly defeated in Warringah sent such a strong message.
Yeah.
Can I, Daniel? I know we have another question, but Malcolm, while you're on the right again and sort of the populism, a question I meant to ask earlier about the interventions by the Murdoch media. I'm going to ask what might seem very naive, having worked there for 20 years, but what's in it for them, and in terms of the Murdoch media here? And what's in it for the hard right, given that my observation has been that conflict sells newspapers, and as much as they might like building up leaders, they know that there's a lot of value in tearing them down, because that sells more papers.
Yeah. Well, I think there's probably an element of that there, but look, my observation, Christine, of the Murdochs as one family and many other plutocrats and billionaires over the years, is that they find the exercise of power incredibly attractive for its own sake. They like politicians who are deferential and do as they're told. I mean, don't kid yourself. I mean, one of the things that the big end of town, well, not big end, that's such a stupid expression. I'll withdraw that. One of the things that these billionaires, particularly the media ones, were always ambivalent about me, even Packer when I worked for him, because while they appreciated the fact that I was, always pro-business and understood the industry and understood business, better than most politicians, the fact that I was not deferential, that I was independent, both by temperament and circumstance, all of that was unappealing. As I say in the book, a politician who is broke and cannot pay his household bills that doesn't necessarily endear him to the electorate, but it is very endearing if you are a wealthy person.
We've got another question here from Michael Dowling, who I might call forward. Hi. Oh, maybe not. I think Michael's question was essentially that the ABC has been, the way he expressed it in the chat was that the ABC has been emasculated and provided little of a foil to the now toxic propaganda and absurdities of the Murdoch media. Why did you not restore the damaging funding cuts to ABC? Well,
look, we were making savings across the budget. I think the ABC has got very substantial financial resources. Obviously, they would like to have more, but the diminution in the ABC's revenues pales into insignificance compared to what's happened elsewhere in the industry. Look, I'm a great supporter of the ABC, a defender of the ABC, but there have been times when I felt it could be better run, better managed. And, I'm just saying that in terms of getting a better bang for the buck. I've never objected to the ABC from a political bias point of view. My concerns with the ABC, and I have had arguments with them from time to time, has been really about the quality of the journalism. I felt that there's, there just isn't the sufficiently strong editorial discipline there. It's in terms of getting the facts right. Getting the facts right and doing a good job from an editorial point of view. I mean, it's you take The Guardian, which is a, very good newspaper, and it's obviously left, it's avowedly left of centre newspaper, right? There's no bones about that. But, it's got very strong editor in Russ Bridger, now Kath Varner, globally, and of course, Lenore Taylor here. I mean, there's a lot of, Lenore is a tough, disciplined, fact-based sort of editor, and that's what you need, because in this age of fake news and alternative facts, the mainstream media outlets, and in particular the ABC, have to be scrupulous about getting the facts right.
The next.
I will just follow-up question first. Can I ask then? It's interesting, Malcolm, you say that you acknowledge, say, A Guardian is a left-wing publication, and I'm sure that
it's a smaller. They would say they're smaller liberal. I mean,
yes, yeah.
And I don't want to tag them too much, but yeah.
But I guess, so to be clear, you are not saying that a media outlet needs to be to pretend or attempt to be completely equal in coverage. I think we can get caught.
Exactly. Yeah. No, a newspaper can be, can be avowedly left or right, but I think it was Julia Gillard who said this once. Don't make shit up. I mean, that's
Can't be too hard.
Not as eloquent as the misogyny speech, but nonetheless equally to the point. And that's that is the problem. I mean, you look at the News Limited tabloids and the Australian. I mean, they are propaganda sheets now. I mean, one of the most. I mean, there's so many examples, but I remember earlier in the year, Matt Keane, who's a young guy who is the energy minister in New South Wales, and and he's got a contemporary, sensible, rational approach to energy. Wants to transition away from fossil fuels to renewables, and I mean that's sort of common sense, right? And the state's got an objective there. He gave a speech, which was a good speech. But it certainly wasn't revolutionary. It was a good speech that would not have raised an eyebrow anywhere. But because he actually canvassed doing something about climate change, the Telegraph then went to war on him. I don't know if you remember, they had this front page claiming he was a bogus firefighter. And, it was literally and the message was, how dare you take climate change seriously? We are going to beat you up if you do that. And I tell you, that intimidates most politicians. And it's the same technique that Jones employs,
And yet we've seen the Tories in Britain take a much more, dare I say, progressive stance about climate.
Yeah, they have, sure, they have, and this is so basically this crazy, climate change as religion, values rather than fact, is essentially Australia and the US.
So we've covered media a bit here. I wanted to throw to Don E, who has a question which we'll pull forward about where to from here relating to our current context.
Okay.
Don, are you there?
Yes. Hi, Malcolm.
Hey, how are you?
A question. Congratulations on speaking openly about mental health issues. So good on you for that. My question is around Frydenberg's talked about a $4 billion a day hole in the budget. So the government will have to do something. It's looking like a global recession. So what do you think are the most likely things or the best things we can do on both the revenue and expenditure side of the budget, Malcolm?
Well, on the revenue side, I mean, as you know, the difficulty with, you could say, well, put taxes up. Well, that will be a handbrake on the economy. There are very few taxes that aren't, all taxes are to some extent a dead weight on economic activity, some much more so than others. So I don't think increasing taxes is going to be the solution. You've basically got to encourage economic growth, but equally you've got to do so in a way that doesn't, just involve, pay, big handouts to rent seekers, right? So, my view is that we should be focusing on innovation. We should be focusing on entrepreneurship. We want to build confidence. We want to get people investing again. And at the same time, we've got to make sure that the social welfare safety net, and this is obviously going to involve, a consideration of either maintaining or not dialing back too much Newstart or job seeker, as they call it now, that safety net is adequate. So I don't see there being any alternative to deficits for quite a long time. But the good news is, just from a fiscal point of view, the good news is that we start off in a much stronger, fiscal position than a lot of other countries, so, but, the thing that Scott and Josh will be very concerned about doing is creating, they'll be very concerned about creating structural sort of permanent changes. And this is what, a substantial increase in Newstart would mean, which could build in a structural deficit. I mean, this was one of the, I remember back in the days of the Howard government, towards the end of the Howard government, when we had the big surpluses, I was very concerned that we were sort of being presented with three options. One, unsustainable reductions in taxation. Two, unsustainable increases in benefits, whether it be they tax concessions in super or welfare benefits. Or three, you know, infrastructure of dubious quality, you know, bridges to nowhere and roads that weren't really required and that sort of thing. And I mean, so, you know, my view was at that period, that was a time when we really should have been establishing a second sovereign wealth fund, you know, in addition to the future fund, or to augment the future fund. Anyway, that's ancient history, and that's not going to be an issue for a long time. But the most important thing is not to use cyclical circumstances to enable you to build in structural changes that you then can't dial back readily when you need to.
You referenced infrastructure of dubious quality there, so I'm going to go to something that has come up a lot in the chat, Malcolm. NBN. Yep. What went right and what went wrong, and how has it played out to this point?
Well, I think it's doing very well at the moment. I think, and I'd say, thank God we did what we did, because had we pursued Labor's fibre to the premises approach, it would have taken a lot longer to finish it. So it would be, I mean, of course, you know, the NBN, if you talk to the engineers at the NBN, they'd say it'd probably be about half finished now. So you'd have, you know, millions of Australians would have no hope of participating in a call like this. And of course, it would cost a lot more, you know, about $30 billion more, which means ultimately it would be more expensive. Look, I think that the big mistake was, as usual, the big mistake was made at the beginning. When Rudd decided, in a sort of brain snap, I think, to build an entirely new government-owned telco. That was nuts. If you want to see what we should have done, look across the Tasman. Australians, by the way, generally pay too little respect to New Zealand. And the New Zealanders very often do things better than us. My old mate John Key would say it's because they don't have as much money and they can't afford to waste. He says we'd probably waste the same sort of money you did if we had it, but because we don't, we've got to be more intelligent. But what they did in New Zealand, they said, okay, we want to have universal broadband. We want to have as much fibre as we can, you know, fibre to the prem if we can. And clearly in New Zealand, labour costs are lower, so it's cheaper to do that type of thing, because the bulk of the cost in a broadband rollout is not the technology or the electronics, it's the civil works, you know, and as I've often said, Moore's law does not apply to digging holes. Anyway, the most important thing the Kiwis did was this. The government said, right, we have a big bag of gold to subsidise broadband upgrades, because we know it's not, you know, totally economic. We're going to make it available in a reverse auction, area by area, but you cannot apply if you are a vertically integrated telco. So you can't apply if you're a retail telco. Telecom New Zealand did not want to split up. And then a couple of areas were sold off, in effect, to electricity companies who had, you know, poles and wires and pits and had, you know, could do all that stuff. Telecom New Zealand, you know, said, good grief, we are about to be put out of business here. So they quickly split their telco between a retail business, which is now called Spark, and the network business called Chorus. And Chorus then bid for and got the rest of it. So Chorus, what was the advantage? You had a company which had not only owned the pits and poles and pipes and conduits and everything, but they had a workforce that had been doing that for 100 years. You know, it wasn't a startup. So they basically had all of that continuity. And that's one of the reasons why the Kiwis got there a lot more cost effectively than us. So, you know, ultimately, I have, and you know, the crazy thing is the Kiwis were doing it at the same time as we were. I mean, we could have simply just copied them, but it wasn't, it was not, it was, anyway, it was colossally way. I think the NBN, the way Labor approached it, I think there was about $20 billion of value destroyed, which you can't recover.
Malcolm, I might just cut in because I think we've only got a couple of minutes left, and there's two other questions I wanted to kind of throw to you. One, which was some of the most interesting things about the book were the things that you didn't touch on. So one of the things that kind of fascinated me was that you converted to Catholicism in your adult life, which, you know, isn't a particularly common thing for people to do. What motivated that, and what role does religion play in your life now?
Well, Look, to be honest, it doesn't play a great role in my life in a formal sense. The reason I didn't cover it in my book was the book was long enough as it is, and I wasn't sort of quite ready to write about that. It would have, a lot of people have said, why didn't you include this? Why didn't you include that? And I said, well, the book's 700 pages already. So, but I think it's I'm not an atheist or an agnostic, but like a lot of Catholics, and I do say this in the book, a lot of Catholics, my relationship with the church has been really unsettled by the whole, child sexual abuse, scandals. And it's, frankly, that's, I think that's a big issue for many Catholics. It is hard. The institution itself has lost the trust of many of its congregation.
One quick question, which hopefully you have just a short answer to, which is what Don. So Tony Goodfellow in the chat asked, what would you do differently if you had your time again as a PM? Is there one particular thing that you would have done differently?
I'm sure there are many things, and some of them are in the book, but nothing of a sort of a momentous kind. I mean, I've talked about Mediscare. I mean, there are things that with the benefit of hindsight, I would have done differently. Yeah, certainly, I would have nailed the Mediscare the minute it rose its head up in the House of Representatives earlier in 2016. I would have jumped on it like a ton of bricks. And if we'd done that, that was the time to do it. So, the criticism of the campaign and of Tex and of me and Nutty and so forth, with not being more negative in the campaign. Look, it's fair criticism. There's no doubt about that. But I have no real confidence that the outcome would have been different. It might have even been worse if we'd done that. But there's no question that we should have got onto it much sooner. And that's with one of the lessons I was talking about with Christine.
That makes sense. So we're going to wrap up now. But one thing that we like to do at the end of these sessions is, obviously there's a lot of fairly depressing things that are on people's minds at the moment. So I'll give you a few moments to think about this. But what is something in your personal life that you've felt really grateful and glad about over the last few weeks? I'll give you a few moments to reflect on that while I just do a bit of wrapping up. So firstly, I wanted to thank Christine, who has done a wonderful job helping moderate this. I want to thank Malcolm for joining us and giving us so much of his time and so many of his thoughts. I also want to thank everyone who's joined us on the chat and who has participated. Thank you for coming. I think it's been a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure, I have no doubt, you'll have many complex and varied views, as any topic about politics always triggers, but I think that we've tried to cover as much of that as we possibly can. I also just wanted to acknowledge that over the rest of this week and next week, there are a whole bunch of really, really interesting sessions. Notably, tomorrow we are actually going to be joined by complete coincidence by your fine wife, Lucy, Malcolm, as we talk about cities and essentially what they'll look like after the COVID pandemic passes. We've seen people flock back to cities over the last 20 years, but all of a sudden, the things that have made them so attractive are actually now a bit worrying. So what does that mean for the long term? Then next week, we've got a whole spread of very other interesting topics, such as the Political Geek Fest with Catherine and Peter Lewis, who we've got here as well, where they'll unpack all the things that have been happening in the political world today and also share some interesting and unique research and insights that have come to them. So it's always a really interesting dinner table conversation, as well as the Guardian Book Club on Friday, which will be next Friday, not tomorrow, in 8 days' time, which is the first time we've held that, and already looks like it's going to be a really fantastic event. So please check out australianhome.com.au and have a look at all those events and just sign up for any you might be interested in. But to come back to you, Malcolm, what's something that you've been feeling really grateful and glad about?
Well, you're tomorrow's guest, Lucy. So no, it's been, obviously we've never spent so much time together in the one place. So but it's been great. I'm very I'm very, very lucky, and of all of my blessings, that is the one I count the most.
Wonderful. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone who has joined us.
Thanks.
Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks a lot. See you.
Bye.
Yeah.